Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, when Boy George cut the top rate of tax from 50p to 45, he was asked at the time whether he would personally benefit. And he couldn't have been clearer. I'm not a winner from this budget. I'm not personally affected, he told the BBC. Well, we now know that he has in fact been benefiting from his own tax cut after publishing his tax returns and that frenzy of disclosure that followed the leaking of the Panama Papers. Now, the gain wasn't huge, hardly life-changing for a well-off chap like the Chancellor. So maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe it does.
Hello. Nothing to see here. Nothing irregular or criminal or morally dubious. Just a quick inventory of this week's offshore assets. Between you and me, if the costume budget's anything to go by, I'm not sure there'll be much in the vaults here at this week's offshore tax haven, but everything has to be accounted for. And accounting for investments is what David Cameron had to do during his Easter holidays. The Prime Minister had to fess up that he'd profited from his dad's Panama trust. While his finances were all legit, the leaked Panama Papers raised issues of tax transparency and regulation. Conceptua? Time for a cocktail.
The publication of a Prime Minister's tax information in this way is unprecedented, but I think it is the right thing to do. But let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that this should apply to all MPs. The Chancellor has today published information on his tax return in a similar way to the Shadow Chancellor and the First Minister for Scotland. Now, this begs the question of how far the publication of tax information should go.
With all this stuff about tax havens, Labour ancient Dennis Skinner erupted. It happens from time to time. He was duly red-carded by the Speaker.
Withdraw!
I know what you're talking about.
Very simple. Withdraw!
This man has done more to divide this nation than anybody else. He's looked after his own pocket. I still refer to him as Dodgy Dave. Do what you like.
I order the honourable member to withdraw immediately from the House for the remainder of this day's sitting.
Then we had this little vignette from the Conservatives' man of the people, Sir Alan Duncan. Oh, I say.
May I support the Prime Minister in fending off those who are attacking him, particularly in thinking of this place, because if he doesn't, we risk seeing a House of Commons which is stuffed full of low achievers who hate enterprise, hate people who look after their own family, and who know absolutely nothing about the outside world.
With politicians' tax returns being published, the Prime Minister had a pop at Jeremy Corbyn, who filed his late.
Well, I'm glad he wants to get on to our responsibilities to pay our taxes. I think that's very important. I thought his tax return was a metaphor for Labour policy. It was late, it was chaotic, it was inaccurate, it was uncosted. That's exactly
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for drawing attention to my own tax return. There, warts and all, the warts being my handwriting, all being my generous donation to HMRC. I actually paid more tax than some companies owned by people that he might know quite well.
Our steel industry is in peril. Labour is worried that steelmaker Tata wants to leave Britain within 4 months. The question of nationalisation is buzzing round Westminster, and the Business Secretary hinted that the government wasn't ruling out some form of intervention.
The formal sales process begins today. I've been in contact with potential buyers, making clear that the government stands ready to help. This includes looking at the possibility of co-investing with a buyer on commercial terms.
I welcome the the long overdue admission from this government that it is their duty to help find a future for UK steelmaking. I just hope it isn't a case of too little, too late.
Former Foreign Secretary David Miliband was in town this week, shoring up support for the Vote to Stay in Europe campaign. And finally, posties up and down the land have been delivering a controversial EU referendum leaflet promoting a vote to stay in Europe.
Your post, Mr. Letts.
Ah, I've been waiting for this. This vexed the Brexiteers, who said public money was being used to push one side of the debate. And at PMQs, David Cameron was reminded of strong feelings on his own side about this leaflet.
Over 200,000 economic migrants came from the European Union in the period for which we've got figures. And yet the propaganda sheet sent out to the British people claims we maintain control of our borders. Have we withdrawn from the free movement of people, or is that sheet simply untrue?
The nation's been waiting for Jeremy Corbyn to lay out his deck chairs on the EU, and finally we've learned he's up for some R&R. Not rest and recuperation, but remain and reform.
There is a strong socialist case for staying in the European Union, just as there's also a powerful socialist case for reform and progressive change in Europe. That's why we need a Labour government to stand up at the European level for industries and communities in Britain, to back public ownership and public services, to protect and extend workers' rights, and to work with our allies to make both Britain and Europe work better for working people.
It's been a funny old week, really. There's been the offshore tax hoo-ha, and then the row about the EU leaflet. For some, that's been too much secrecy. For others, too much information. Now, how about that This Week inventory?
Quentin Letts locked inside the high-security vault in Leadenhall Street's Revolution Bar. A nation rejoices. Michael, the Panama Papers quickly narrowed down in this country, and I'll come back to whether this is right or wrong, but they narrowed down to a story about the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's late father. Did either of them do anything wrong?
Certainly nothing has been proven wrong that either one of them did. I think it's a kind of political sin. I mean, I'm quite a highly paid person, and yet I've never had any dealings with any offshore investments or trusts. And so I deduced from that those who do have contact with offshore investments and trusts are a very tiny minority of the population indeed. And so, as it were, the political sin is to be associated with something which is incomprehensible to the great mass of the population.
From what we know now, did either of them do anything wrong?
No, not by the letter of the law, but I would agree with Michael here. I mean, I think the Conservatives' political strategy has been to try and detoxify the party, move to the centre, say they're compassionate, one nation. I think Cameron has succeeded on modernising the Tories on social issues, on issues like gay marriage, but not on economic issues. Yes, they've done some good things around raising the minimum wage, but these have been far outweighed by the cuts to tax credits and then this sense that a few at the very, very top do well and get even bigger breaks, whether that's on inheritance tax or capital gains tax. And that is a real problem for them. And it blows a hole through their central strategy about being this one nation party.
And it brought back associating with him all the things he hates: posh, wealthy, privileged and so on. But as long as offshore assets are declared when required by the law, and we live in a globalised world, what's wrong with having them? I mean, MP's pension fund is partly invested offshore. The Guardian has offshore interests as well.
That's
lots
right.
of
But look,
rich folk have offshore interests.
What is the real story here about Panama, which has got lost in everything about Cameron, his father, and ending up with MPs publishing their tax returns? It is that extremely wealthy individuals are trying to hide their money to avoid paying taxes in Panama, and bag carriers for everyone from Putin to Mugabe and Assad are possibly trying to launder money. Now, that is what we should have been focusing on over the past week. That's the real issue of the Panama Papers, and I fear that that's got lost in the debate.
That's very interesting, because isn't it the case, Mike? I mean, isn't this right? The Panama Papers raise huge issues about global wealth, the inability of governments to tax it, sometimes governments themselves using these things to hide it. I mean, maybe our parochial concerns about tax returns or the Prime Minister's father have deflected from these much bigger issues.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, Putin, who has a lot to answer for in these revelations, of course, is facing no sort of scrutiny whatsoever.
So no one's going to arrest him.
Well, there's not even any press scrutiny because the press isn't free. No, I agree. It has been a diversion. And the even greater diversion was into the issue of inheritance tax. I mean, the legislation is perfectly clear on inheritance tax. It's set out all the ways in which you can make it more or less a voluntary tax. If you're willing to give away your wealth during your lifetime, and then if you're lucky enough to live 7 years, you can effectively not pay inheritance tax. There's nothing dodgy about that. It's all set out in the statute. And of course, it was in place when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. It was in place when Tony Blair was Prime Minister.
I very much take the point that you made, but what is done in this country. So was Mr. Cameron right to publish his tax return?
I think he had to in the end.
In the circumstances?
I think he had to in the end, but that doesn't deal with the big question. Look, you know, Cameron has made a small step forward by getting agreements amongst some of our territories that they will compile this register of beneficiary ownership, but it doesn't go far enough. We don't know whether anyone other than UK authorities can scrutinise those registers.
There are increasing OECD agreements coming into place, and there's already EU agreements. I mean, there has been, since the crash in 2008, there's been huge pressure on governments to do more.
They're not public, so you have to know there's a problem to ask, and I think the only way to deal with this is to make those registers public.
But there will be automatic exchange of information now. It won't be public, but there will be automatic exchange between jurisdictions. It will make a big difference.
It will, but I would like to see them public. I want to make sure that authorities in other countries, other than UK authorities, can scrutinise what's happening in our territories. There's a lot more that we could do, and I think all the distraction about, you know, MPs' tax returns has taken our eye off the real question here.
I mean, maybe it has been a distraction, Michael, because surely by definition tax returns only tell voters how public figures are complying. I mean, if they're not complying, it won't be in their tax return.
I certainly think there are enough disincentives for people to become a member of Parliament. I mean, if you took drugs when you were 16, if you had, I don't know, a gay relationship when you were 17, you know, whatever, and now you've got to publish your tax return as well. I mean, I know that Alan Duncan probably made his point in a rather clumsy way in the House of Commons, the one that we saw in the film.
In an obnoxious way.
You were upset by that.
I was massively upset by it. I was shocked, to be honest.
But
I don't know why, but I was.
If it becomes the norm that MPs have to publish their tax returns, we will have even fewer people stepping forward to be MPs. I must say, I find one of the great joys of not being in the House of Commons anymore that I don't have to answer questions about my private income.
OK. Labour, Europe. You buy into the idea that Jezza loves the European Union?
Well, he didn't say he did love it. I thought he was pretty honest. And you might be surprised to hear me say this, Andrew, but I think he probably, on this occasion, captured the mood of quite a lot of people, which is sceptical.
Yes.
It needs to change, but on balance,
stay in.
Stay in.
Yeah, and I think that's probably right, isn't it?
The less glorious way of putting that is that we're very unhappy as a country being in it, and we're too frightened to leave. And if that really is the best that can be said for it, it's a hopeless situation. I mean, I don't quite know why Jeremy Corbyn is under such scrutiny today. And the fact is, I don't believe that David Cameron is any more Euro-enthusiastic than Jeremy Corbyn is.
But there's an issue here, Liz, it's a final issue just to address. It's pretty clear, I think, that a majority of Conservative voters will probably vote to leave. I don't know how big that will be, but it could be like 55-45.
You've got to get the Labour
vote out. So how are you going to get this Labour? Mr Cameron needs the Labour vote to win.
This was a really important speech. Labour voters and supporters needed to hear the Labour leader say this, because all they've heard so far is a Tory leader. And they're relying on us to get the vote out.
Because he said it more than 2 months before polling day.
Well, he has to say it a lot
And
more,
he will
does he
say
not?
it, and he will say it again
Will he?
and
Well,
again.
I very much doubt whether he will. I think he's done what he felt he had to do. Anything that happens 2 months before polling day is completely irrelevant. I mean, it's like Ian Duncan Smith's resignation. Who remembers Ian Duncan Smith? It's completely irrelevant, and I don't think there'll be any great effort to turn out the Labour vote, and that is the peril for the PM.
Do you think he will campaign? Will he do lots of rallies?
I don't know, but I am our East Midlands European champion, and I am busting a gut to get the Labour vote out on June the 23rd.
Well,
and I will be knocking on the door and getting them out.
Then I'm slightly more
I
frightened
need
than I
as
was.
much help as I can get. It's going to be a
Very
really
well.
close. It's going to be a really close fight.
I know the feeling. I often need as much help as I can get too.